Hello, this is Ken Bentley, and I'd like to talk to you about two new books I've produced to follow up on an earlier one published last year on Port Elizabeth, which we see here. So that was created to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Port Elizabeth's having been named in 1820. I grew up in East London and moved to Port Elizabeth in 1984. So for the first 27 years of my life, this was my hometown, and I've sort of undervalued, I think, what was achieved in its development. So I've subtitled this book A Personal Visual History to mark 170 years since it was named, and 150 years since as a municipality. So if I wade a page through this, let's just see. So I've set it on this double page setting, like turning over the pages of a book. But you'll see when the PDF that I'm trying to market now of this thing, because it's impossible for me to print this on a quality like the Port Elizabeth one. That was funded, thankfully, by GFI in Port Elizabeth, and that we've sold over 500 copies of this book. I essentially just acted as the writer and compiler of the book, and they published it, and it was at their expense. But now I'm stuck with this position where I've created another book, in fact, two new books, this one on East London and another one I'll show you on Grahamstown. Same sort of concept, using old photographs and my own recent photographs to try and string together a concise history of both these cities and how they were developed. Anyway, let's have a look. So the intro, this is now, I work on Publisher. I don't have costly software to rely on. So to me, Publisher is the people's software, and it's what, if you know how to use it, I think you can get a fairly good product. So obviously I'd love to see this all published and printed and, hard copies made. But it's not going to happen unless some kind person can, put up 50 grand, and then I will get a little cut and they can sell them for whatever. But anyway, so here you can actually see the German settler. This was Baron von Stutterheim. So I trace this whole history, I trace the whole frontier war scenario and what led to the development of East London, but that's just as an introduction. My real interest is in the city itself and how that developed. So we only have, about 7 pages of introductory comments and stuff. And then we get on to just like Fort Glamorgan, which was like the first substantial British presence. And then the development of the harbour, that is actually the main purpose of East London's development. And I mean, it's fascinating stuff. And there's this top left picture here is actually a painting, but there aren't many drawings of early East London, unlike PE. Well, in this other book, I could rely on a lot of early paintings of PE. So anyway, as we progress through here, I've used color as well. So in this Publisher software, we've got a thing called Page Design up at the top here. And it just enables you to choose a series of sort of complementary colors, which you can use to offset your photographs to best effect. And hopefully I've done that. So, I mean, look at this harbour. This could be London back in 1850, and in fact, this is, or 1880 or something, that's East London Harbour. And so I trace the whole, they had this pontoon ferry here. That was the way, because the early town was the West Bank. And then they had this problem of crossing to the East Bank, because the actual purpose of establishing a port was to link up with King Williamstown, which is slightly older than East London, and was the headquarters for the British sort of garrison, much like Grahamstown was, in that border region. And so we traced the whole pontoon ferry thing, and then ultimately they needed a bridge. But at this point, it was all these historians. So the building of the harbour walls continues apace, well ahead of Port Elizabeth, because PE had the wonderful bay, which only occasionally was battered by howling gales. But East London is a very open stretch of coastline, and they needed a powerful, strong harbour wall to shelter the access into the Buffalo River. A fascinating story to see. I mean, this is early engineering that went into this thing. We'll see if I can find those. Literally, I mean, huge cranes back there in the 1870s. Nothing like that existed in the Eastern Cape, I mean, apart from what was happening in Port Elizabeth. So here we have people establishing a major port. As you can see here, this was now back in 1947, and it's already huge. And this was when the Queen, Elizabeth II, opened the dry dock. So what I've done is I've taken different facets of PE, of East London. Sorry, I keep saying PE because that's where I live. And then sort of seen how they've evolved and try to represent that. And so now in the next chapter, we go on to the bridges, the pontoon ferries first. So, and then the early bridge, I think this was about 1912. I can't see exactly here, but I've got it all. I've researched all the history of the development of these bridges. Then they built a second bridge. You can actually see both bridges in this picture. And all the detail about that is included. And then, of course, the third bridge in the 1970s, the big high one, which is now the main access point, route into East London City. And then fascinating story about the development of West Bank, because this was the first settlement in East London. So I went for a walk around this area in 2015 and photographed. I had no plans for a book. I just thought, well, I've never really done this. Let's have a look at old West Bank, And then I discovered when I researched this thing that West Bank was the first place. And a lot of these buildings, like the old post office, have incredible history. And of course, it's right next to the harbour, and you had the grain elevator there. And I discovered that a year after I took these pictures, the grain elevator was demolished. There's actually footage on YouTube of the explosions, how they set explosives up to bring this thing down. So I'm not going to go through all these, but we trace a whole lot of the history of the West Bank, about the schools, the churches. And then the next chapter, we move to the beachfront, the Esplanade, and this wonderful early old hotel. And then there's just fascinating photographs of the early development of the beachfront. The aquarium, there was even a thing across from the aquarium. Preceded the aquarium. It was called the Beach Pavilion, I think. I can't read my text because it's quite small here. I have to keep it small because if you're filming with a little video like this on a camera, it starts going a bit crazy. So anyway, we continue right through the whole development of the esplanade between the Buffalo River and the Eastern Beach. I don't want to make this too long, so I'm going to push forward to the next chapter just to give you an idea. And this focuses on the Market Square, which obviously for an early city is the focal point for development. And everything's sort of spread from there. So, first it's much like with Port Elizabeth, there's ox wagons bringing, stuff from the hinterland, wool and whatever for export, and it was a real market. And then it sort of evolved, and now it's a parking area. When I was growing up, it was a parking area. But, and then the city hall. So we're looking at the whole market precinct. So I call it, it's the Market Square, Oxford Street and environs. So then obviously the city hall is a huge factor. And then the Daily Dispatch. I mean, I worked there for 6 months as a teenager. So I was fascinated to read about its history, and obviously was a great admirer of Donald Woods in my youth. Then there's just such wonderful architecture in East London, and I've tried to capture that as I've waded through the old photographs and then my own recent photographs, the post office, the railway station. I already got around. I know I didn't cover everything, and there will be people who said, oh, well, you missed that or you missed this, and that's just life, This is a very personal thing based on my idea of what constitutes East London, and I think you'll find it fascinating. So let me not dwell on all these. I already do. I look at a lot of these buildings. These are right down below Fleet Street towards the harbour. And, wonderful old architecture's there. A lot of it's Fort Hare University now. And then up at the top end of Oxford Street, the museum development, the schools, Clarendon and Selwyn, Guild Theatre. And then because my father was sort of raised in Cambridge, we had a connection there. And so I looked at a bit of Cambridge, which is quite historic in its own right, the old town hall. And then Nahoon with the Dolphin Hotel prominent. And then my home village, Bonza Bay. Fascinating stories. I mean, this already was close to my heart, so obviously I gave it a bit of a go. But I mean, look at these people on horseback. Queen Elizabeth and her sister, Margaret, in 1947. And then the whole development of I think it's the Northeast Expressway. So all these bridges over the Nahoon River. I mean, I walked across the Batting Bridge while it was semi-collapsed during that flood in 1970. So yeah, that's part of it. And then I thought this was a nice touch to end the book with some light stuff. And that's the Grand Prix, vital part of East London's history. The Joan Harrison story I look at a bit, and the airport. East London had the first powered air flight in South Africa. So anyway, that's my East London book. Then let's just take a look at a quick look at Grahamstown. I've done the same thing. Each of these books is going for 170 Rand. Okay, so I've done a square format for Grahamstown. I'm going to put it in this double page thing, but when you buy the PDF, you'll get it as single pages. So again, with Grahamstown, I've done an introduction, a bit of the history of the town and how it came to exist. That is Graham, Colonel Graham. And, you know, I'm unashamedly objective on this thing. I'm not going to talk about whether it was right or wrong for it to have developed. I'm looking at the fact that it did develop. And I mean, look at this fantastic early drawing of Grahamstown, which was established in 1812. You know, that's 8 years before the settlers arrived. 4,500 British settlers. But, you know, great photographs and paintings, obviously. But look at this. I mean, that's the original church that became the cathedral. And in fact, that's all that remains of that original church, and is now part of the cathedral. And so it's the history of this whole area around the cathedral, this town hall or the city hall. And you know, look at this. This is the Drosty. So this is where Rhodes University, this was actually demolished, and this is where the Rhodes University sort of central administrative offices are. But that old building there still stands. That one still is being used. And these all went up in, I think, the 1830s. So what I liked about Grahamstown is that look at the Drosty Arch. I mean, a lot of these historic buildings are still there. They've just really looked after, even though I know it's potholes and it's poorly managed. But over the last 200 years, they've ensured that the character of this place has been retained. I mean, I believe the station really went to rack and ruin, and I've got a few photos, but it looks as though they've salvaged it. There's wonderful, interesting monuments and so forth. And this building, I mean, the first jail, still stands there in High Street. And the whole town was laid out around this early building, which actually didn't look quite like it does today. It was just like a little house, a humble house, and it got a nice gable on at some point. So, yeah, that's Guy Butler's former house. High Corner, he called it. So I've read Butler's autobiographies, and, you know, I can identify with what he said. I mean, that is like a focal point in Grahamstown. And then I had to go to the Albany Museum and see the picture of a painting by Frederick Irons of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, I think he would be, about 5 generations back, which is this guy, Footer, who came out on that first, the Chapman, the first of the 1820 settler ships to arrive in Angola. So I give a bit of history because I've got several of my forebears are 1820 settlers, or were 1820 settlers. Yeah, just trying to move through this a bit. So the cathedral, I mean, look at, a wonderful place. You know, I've got the interior bit there and views from all sides of it. That's Rhodes University, the Drosty Arch. Yeah. And then I do focus on a lot on this church square, they call it. You know, with these wonderful buildings at the side there. More interesting monuments. Yeah, and I took a long time to compile this and lay it out and find the nicest pictures to capture something of the spirit of the place. You know, look at this wonderful church this is called Christ Church, and it's like 1870s. It's in immaculate condition, or it was when I was there in 2015. Brilliant. And then I did a walk along High Street, just looking at some of the buildings and appreciating the fact that so many are in character. This is still a nice looking, English looking town. And then, I mean, this was Peter Tief's house. It's it is part now of the Rhodes campus, I think. So several of the buildings, I mean, I missed a gem. There was one house up Prince Albert Road or street that I didn't get to. But that's life, you know. And then this, I mean, how many cities in the world have something like the old Provost, which is a fantastic old prison, which is now, when we were there, was a tea room. There is so much history in this place, and it's reflected in these buildings. I mean, this is Artificers Square, where they gave small plots of land to people to develop a real English-style semi or detached housing setup, and it looks probably very similar to how it did 200